Hi, I'm Seamless, and today is Saturday, which means like 2 or so-ish hours ago should have been time for how to bass. And today I'm going to show you how to make this sound. Yeah. So if you're following me on Facebook, you'll have seen me make a post about how I was experimenting with 500 Vocodex bands. Well, today I actually only have 300 because it turns out it's a little bit hard to get a reasonable result out of using just straight up 500 bands. But let me explain the concept behind what I was trying to accomplish with the split bands here. But to be real quick, what's going on is that there's a harmonic. These are mostly the same variation of the same sound. I'll show you how I make that, obviously. And then you go into Vocodexes, and then I use the band distribution to sort of quarantine each Vocodex into a specific frequency range. So, like, here's the low one. You know, see it starts low and ends in the middle, kind of there. And here's the mid one where it starts kind of low mid, ends in high mid. And then here's the high one where it starts sort of in the mids and then ends high. The benefit of this is that all three of these have all 100 bands, and what this distribution window, this graph line is saying is that the bands are fitting within this point, and then covering this curve being distributed as such. If these were all straight lines, they would be distributed evenly. Like all 100 bands would just be fit. Wow, man, would be fit in between these 2 points and straight line at the end of it. But this curve here represents that there are more bands at the high than there are on the low. But of course, because there are 100 of them, there are a lot of bands. Period, and they just sort of scrunch together like that. Now, the value of this is that each individual Vocodex can go to a maximum of 100 bands, so this means that now we have essentially 300 band Vocodex. In this example, they're overlapping quite a lot, but I discovered in my experiments that if I did just make them completely linear, where like this point ends where this point begins, and that kind of thing, which you can do, to basically as many of them as you want. Like I started with 5, and then here's just 3, but you can do that with the band distribution window, which is kind of cool because it means that, like, yeah, there's 100 bands, but if I wanted to have a 1,000 band Vocodex thing, I could do that. Part of the reason why that doesn't work out quite as much as you might expect, especially for this particular application where we're just kind of applying at the basis using the sound being its own carrier modulator without any extra secondary modulator, yike. Just one yike, not enough yike to be yikes, but just yike. I guess we're talking about something to do with, one of the reasons why this doesn't work out was just carrier modulator. And that's because that kind of sharpness that we're used to hearing is a result of the bands being muddled enough together or thick enough or like thin on the ground potentially each other, that's sort of why that was made that way. And when you go thin on bandwidth, you typically get that kind of like ringy sort of almost like pipe organ-y shouting kind of thing. And as we'll talk about when we get to the specifics of these guys, like I'm actually taking advantage of a little bit of that with the minimum time being off on the envelope controls, and they're all being really fast, which is creating a lot of that kind of distortion. So the more bands you have, though, the more like the modulator it'll sound, whereas the less bands you have, you're mostly just opening up a big filter to let the carrier through. And if you do that up all the way up the spectrum, you get more or less what the carrier sounds like, and if we're using a sharp sound, you're going to get a sharp sound out. But if you use all the bands, then it'll be such a shit show with the phase profile and everything, and then also whatever you're using for your carrier, that it'll actually sound, or modulator rather, that it'll sound a lot more like the modulator in that example, which is why lower bands tend to work out. Sometimes there's reasons and ways around all these things, but just by the default usage, that tends to be how they work out. So let's actually talk about making this stuff. So these are all Reese Harmer things. Basically what we got going on is in the harmonic phase window. So this just drop down menu gets you into where like all the business is. This is typically where the parameters listing goes, but you can also go to the shaping changes, where we change individual like specific things like harmonic phase per harmonic, which is what this graph does. And what I did here is I put a point down here and put a point up here, and then selected the wave line type, which gets us this control where we're able to kind of like squeeze in the line type, which is ensuring more or less that the phases are different enough per harmonic that it gets the kind of blurred result that I want. In this example, what happens when we do it like this is that we actually get a little bit of a kind of tighter sound because the harmonics being sort of like this rhythmically out of phase like this. We end up getting a particular distribution on things that net us a neat result when we distort it. Along with, you know, unison and whatnot. But even if we didn't do any of these things, this is what that would sound like. So that's what the harmonic phase purpose is. So the thing I did over here on the detune is that what the detune does is that it moves the harmonics away from the fundamental. Like that. And what this does when we distort stuff or otherwise compress the signal very hard against itself is that it'll create that rhythmic phase cancellation. So how fast and how big a pitch change we're using on the detune is how fast that particular sort of reaching business will be. Oh, I have to sneeze, but I won't sneeze. Just gonna sneeze in the middle of me talking. Like that. This works on either the saw side or the square side. It's worth noting that if you go to the square side, like I like to go to the square side, which is by doubling the D2 multiplier, if I wanted that same speed out of it, I'd have to also double the difference. So in this case, a difference of 3, which sounds like this fast. In order to sound that fast, it has to be a difference of 6. There are certain benefits to doing it in that way versus doing it this way. But they're situational. And then of course unison. I'm just kind of screwing it up and messing around with it. And in particular, this is the one that's going into the high frequencies. So I let it be particularly a mess. And I have changed the harmonic unison pitch value per harmonic, which you can do in this particular graph, the harmonic unison pitch window. And this is changing how much unison, like how the pitched amount, like unison depth, how much pitch difference there is at a per harmonic level. As you can see, they're all very low values. Typically, they're like up here and straight, and you can either go more or less. And the less in this regard can actually go all the way down to nothing. So this means that the fundamental has no unison on it, which is contributing to like this thing being as smooth as it is. Because if there was a lot of unison sort of business going on, the rhythmic nature of this change on the detune wouldn't be as static. It would be a bit different. This gets distorted, and nothing else is happening here. Oh yeah, so I did change a bit of the local EQ, which alters the sort of harmonic presence on a per note basis. You can kind of see this dark area up here kind of following around the note. That's because this graph, that's where this little thing here is creating, follows around the note. Versus this EQ, which is the global EQ, which does not follow around a note. You can see like this is big cut here, which is staying static. And given that both of these, all of this process that's going on into like the additive nature on the actual harmonics themselves are happening before the distortion. So this change in the spectral sort of weighting will change the distortion effect on it, which is a handy tool in general, where you EQ yourself before distortion as opposed to after distortion to shape what the distortion will do to something, as opposed to trying to shape what the distortion has done. Anyway, there's 3 of these guys, and they generally have tight differences where like this the mid guy has only 2 voices of unison, a different kind of unison, a different, I think maybe a different shape and harmonic phase, can't really tell. Same actually a different harmonic unison graph set up here, although this lower value probably makes us around in line with that, and this actually would be much lower relative to that value there. Global EQ and local EQ are all active, and that's pretty much it for this. I did experiment with changing the speeds on some of them, but it just sounds a lot better for them to be in concert. And this is the low guy, which I think actually is completely unchanged from the original patch, which I guess is this guy here with the two voices. And yes, this is the mid. The guy, I guess, with the mid one is more like what the original is supposed to be. Yes. So yeah, let's look at the individual vocodexes. This is the high guy. And what went on in here is that this attempt at this how to base, the one that we're looking at right now, is like the 7th attempt at like a how to base. It isn't so much that I haven't been working on it, it's that I have been, and I didn't really like any of the results I was getting. And in regards to doing the whole 500 band thing, which will turn out to be only 300 bands, this is my 3rd or 4th attempt. So I'm saying that because the overlapping nature, like where I specifically chose to put things out here, was a result of a lot of trial and error. And the value of sort of making this curve the way that we're doing here, like the way where things are now, putting a second point in the middle here and kind of moving it around, changes where the bands lie And like if you've ever thought to yourself that like something sounds too vocodey or too vocodery, actually we could probably make it sound like that here. If I could hear it. So if I didn't have this at all, it's just straight up straight line. All right, so that, now it sounds a lot more like regular vocody. Also, see there how like when I move the hold up, it gets less sort of high frequency, and move it down, like noise tends to come in. This is what I mean by having the minimum time values, because this controls how fast essentially the bands react, and if they react really, really fast, then it'll create distortion. And that distortion can be leveraged, interestingly, in concert with what we do with the band distribution. Because I was saying, if we get this kind of like sort of squeezy, squelchy, already like vocody sound, that's a result of where the bands are and where that phase, not literally phase distortion, it might qualify as phase distortion, not totally what I'm talking about, but like where all that happens is a result of where the bands are. So if we change where the bands are, we change that whole quality. Some kind of middle ground is generally where I want to be, in the high frequencies anyway. I also EQ everything in like in post, and specifically, like I probably should do more of that in here because it is literally the same control, but I like to be able to see it in this way just because I'm used to it and used to knowing what it means. This control is particularly interesting because what this does is that it's the multiplier, I guess, and for the oh, you know, I'm not 100% sure what that value means. I'm just noticing up here that it's like X 0.25 versus X4. And like what it does is that like on this end, it makes it adhere more to the characters of the modulator, which means that the band's a little bit more mobile. And over here is it sort of smooths it out a bit. So instead of getting like real sharp motion, we get big rounded curves. And if you think to yourself that it doesn't sound like if you put a saw wave through and you want it to sound more saw-y, like this would be how you do that. See here how it's all watery? And here not so much. That's what that value does. These three knobs here actually create a pretty powerful balance between each other about like that kind of quality. Because you saw how like if I went far enough down here, I came back anyway. And like I could go all the way up here, but then turn this down. And get some of that perhaps sooner than we should. This guy is called the filter fatness. Or flatness? Filter flatness. Huh. And this refers to the tips, like the specific separations of the bands themselves, like the how flat or not they are, which in this example imparts particular behavior onto the bands that could be good or bad depending on your application. But this example, when I wanted to be smoother and a more like the carrier, more like the original sound, this direction is what I wanted. Yep, so that gets EQ'd, it goes into another EQ altogether, and then it gets compressed like this. But let's look at the second guy. Oh, so actually, part of the reason I'm doing unison and all like this is because the vague kind of formative nature, which is being accentuated by the Vocodex's presence, is being created by this uneven phase cancellation in the lows and the mids created by the unison. Normally when I do this, the reset that relies on the detune to create the rhythm, I don't do a lot of unison work because, like I said before, it screws it all up. But if we do low enough values, it kind of morphs slowly, and then this also happens, so we get kind of both things happening. And when we all add it all together and it gets put into a Vocodex, we end up getting much more formative like motion out of it. Much like the other guy, we have very low envelope values, and that kind of like metallic ring we're hearing is more or less from that. Because if I were to just turn them up even a little bit, you can see how it goes away. And that's why it's like really accentuated. And if we go to the band distribution window, we see that like we were talking before about the mids and the highs, and a bit of a curve there, but the fun times happens in the bandwidth selection, like changing here. Like these very thin bands in here are responsible because the spike coming down to say that those bands are very thin. Much like Harmer, Vocodex has a lot of most of the drop time menus are about these individual parameters, but instead of them being global, they are a per band affair as opposed to global, like I just said. So in this regard, we were able to kind of pick where that distortion from the time is itself the most. So on and so forth. Kind of look carried away there. Yeah, and most of their other parameters are more or less the same. Messing around with them. No, I didn't actually do anything with that in there. Look at that. Even the low guy is the easiest one because while I am using the 100 bands that are present, I'm mostly using the carrier fader here. That's just showing. That's just giving us the original carrier. But with Vocodex by itself, it's like all 100 bands are being shoved in this like very low area down here, and like I didn't even like go all the way with them. I guess I am cutting off a whole bunch of bands because I'm failed to bring in the carrier. And of course this is getting high pass, or I guess not. I thought it was getting low pass. I said high pass, but that's not what I meant. With this guy, this particular one, because it has the original signal, is the loudest of the bunch, which you can see in the volume in between in here for these connections, like the low guy, slightly higher, slightly higher. And then it gets all kind of EQ'd together, where we just make changes based on whether or not it sounds good. And then the compression is pretty OTT-like in the sense that like I just grab the bands and kind of push them. The low not so much because it's already very solid. The mids and the highs, I did this style versus this style. And the difference between these two styles is that if there's a sharp quality, especially filtered motion, which isn't really much happening here, but what I mean by that, oh yeah, the sort of wavy filtered motion is that like if you want to have that behavior sort of still be there, then you want to have as much straight lineage as possible. The straight lineage, like this motion to me doing this, is exactly the same as if I had just increased this, so I was having that exact interaction here. Like whether or not I do that is entirely like up to just figuring out what I feel like doing. It's worth noting that like there's two sort of different compression styles, because doing what I'm doing right now is technically expansion, but the results would be similar if I were to do it the other way that I described. However, things like what the attack does and how if I want to maintain certain things would be different depending on those two starting techniques. But when you see the straight line, this is basically saying that like as it comes in, it's coming in like this, and even if it's coming in louder, which is what this steeper curve indicates, it's still coming in relatively like the same motion it was before. You can even see it here, how like yeah, this motion is here, but here's this motion, but just greater and louder. And that's what I wanted out of this particular usage versus the bass, which I just kind of wanted to be a little bit louder, but not by a lot. Neat stuff. I'd probably put an EQ after this if I were using it in a real song, but since it's not a song, this is what we got. Yay. This patch will be available down in the description of this video. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And as usual, have a nice day.